He's sort of responsible for laying out this massive platform on which the Second Temple is thought to have been built, reused blocks from the original temple in that process. So in a lot of ways, this is the closest that observing Orthodox Jews will get to the temple. In fact, many, even today, refuse to travel on the Dome of the Rock, around it itself, for fear that they will enter into the center of the temple, this Holy of Holies, where, according to their religion, they're not supposed to go. There are also very good political reasons for this as well. This area was under Ottoman control, then under the control of Jordan. In 1967, with the Six-Day War, this area was captured by Israel. This part of Jerusalem, which was administered by Jordan, was actually taken and annexed into Jerusalem itself. So again, a very, very contentious, currently contentious situation in which tempers flare high. Modern identity is tied into this past, into archaeology. And there's this very careful balance that both sides try to maintain. For example, Israel, even though it controls this section of Jerusalem, only allows Muslims to travel into the Dome of the Rock, the platform, or the Haram al-Sharif, except for certain designated times. And that site is actually administered by a Waqf, or a communal organization, a Muslim association that has ties to Jordan, that controls what takes place on the top. So it's a very delicate balance. There are conflicts and clashes all the time, and for this reason, no excavation has taken place on top of the Temple Mount. And you can imagine this really serves everybody's interests in a lot of ways. Nobody wants to start excavating in this area for fear of, for example, what if there is no temple to Solomon here? What if it was in a different place? Or what if it didn't exist at all? These are all questions that people engage with. But you have all sorts of different viewpoints coming from politics, coming from religion. If you travel to this area of the world, you'll even find a museum nearby which is dedicated to the construction of the Third Temple, which is supposed to be prophesied in Judaism, the construction of this Third Temple, which should take place on top of the Temple Mount. Of course, right, there is a sanctuary there now that's holy to Muslims. And so again, right, it's a very conflicted space and continues to be so. This temple itself, again, we don't know what it would have looked like, but we do have descriptions, again, in the Torah, Kings 5:16, Chronicles, Ezekiel, in conjunction with some of the architecture that we've seen elsewhere. For example, contemporary temples at places like Ayin Dara. Remember, this is that wonderful temple, right, with its axial entrance, the footsteps leading in from the courtyard to the antechamber into the main hall. This is very much what the Temple of Solomon was supposed to have looked like, at least the way that it's described. It's said to be rectangular, about 25 by 50 meters in size, rising up to a height of 15 meters with a tripartite interior, 2 columns in the front. In fact, I think I have there we go. So it's sort of reconstruction of what the Temple of Solomon is said to have looked like. Two pillars which had names, Boaz and Jachin. And again, this temple was the sort of nexus, again, holding this Holy Spirit of Yahweh within it. In addition, it was the home of the Ark of the Covenant, which again you might be familiar with, this Holy of Holies, which was said to have contained the tablets, the 10 Commandments, the rod of Aaron, of the first Torah scroll, a jar of manna, all sorts of sacred items. In addition, this could be used as a weapon. It was, brought out during battles, even captured at one point by the Philistines. The Philistines capture the ark, and then they suffer all sorts of terrible afflictions, boils, and they end up returning it because it's so powerful. And I had to show Indiana Jones at least once in this class, in case this is the Ark of the Covenant from Raiders of the Lost Ark. Unfortunately, the only image that we actually have of the Ark itself comes from a much later period. This is a synagogue at Capernaum from the 5th century BCE, and an image of the Ark. And actually not even the ark itself. You can see there are wheels attached. This is a little carriage that the ark would have been put in, where it would be brought to some of these synagogues as it would travel from place to place. You can follow up on the ark. It was lost. You actually have a church in Ethiopia that claims to have the ark. Of course, nobody can see it, so we still don't know where the ark of the covenant is. Archaeologically, again, this period is very, very difficult. It's a short period of time, and of course, again, a very contested period of time, and one in which archaeology again can be used to lay claims of legitimacy to the land. So finding archaeological evidence of David and Solomon in the 1970s was pretty pivotal. You had a lot of biblical archaeologists that were digging with the Bible in one hand and a trowel in the other. And we know, right, that that's not really great archaeological practice. If you go looking for something, you're definitely going to find it. That said, there is evidence to say that there might have been some constructions during this time. We find at big cities like Megiddo, Hatzor, Gezer, cities that the Torah says, were fortified by Solomon. We do see constructions like these gates. So these Israelite gates, these 6-chambered gates, which are said to date to the time of Solomon and go hand in hand with these texts. The problem is that it's not really clear that these gates actually date to the time of Solomon. There's a lot of evidence to say that they actually might date to the 9th century, following the reign of Solomon, which again would mean that this biblical account of Solomon and his empire and his building projects might be a little bit overblown. That really David and Solomon, this united monarchy, was much smaller and much more localized than later texts, which are again written later, define it as. Yeah.
How far after the event were the texts written, or the claims?
A lot of these we have in the 1st and 2nd century AD. So we'll get to those, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. And we'll come to those a little bit later. That's really when we see these inscriptions. And we'll actually look at a few other inscriptions that sort of date to this period too. But the majority of it, right, these earliest forms of the Torah that talk about this come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, in Qumran, but much, much later. So this is kind of the problem with this. We do have some inscriptions that are said to date to this period, some Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions. One comes from an ivory pomegranate. You can see it here. Both of these objects are in the Israel Museum. And the pomegranate has been C14 dated. It definitely dates to around 1000 BCE. And we know that pomegranates were sacred to Yahweh. They're sacred to a lot of gods. And this inscription actually reads, "Sacred to the priest of the house of Yahweh," which, again, right, is a dead ringer. We just say, oh, wow, well, there you go, right? There's a C14 dating, a cultic object. It's actually hollow in the bottom, so maybe it was used as a wand of some kind. And then an inscription, right, that mentions Yahweh, dates the period, boom, right? There's our evidence of Solomonic presence. Unfortunately, it's quite likely that this inscription is fake. There have been a number of studies done on it. While the pomegranate might be real, the inscription is thought to have been a fake. And I should mention that's been contested. There's another study that's out with an archaeologist who's gone back and looked at it, and he says it's authentic. But again, right, it's very difficult to disentangle the politics and the political interest in finding David and Solomon in terms of laying a claim to the current state of Israel. And that's not to say that that these people didn't exist. In fact, we do have a stele here from the site of Tel Dan, in which the king of Tel Dan recounts a victory over his enemies. And among those enemies, very similar to Mereneptah, he mentions killing a prince from the house of David. So Beit David, this house of David. So again, evidence that maybe David did exist. But what we don't find, again, are these monumental constructions. We don't find a lot of evidence dating to the time of David. And that which we do is very, very contested. Great example of this contested nature comes from the area of Silwan, which is in Jerusalem. This is the Silwan Valley. And some of the excavations that are taking place there, they were being run by Eilat Mazar. Now recently they've been taken over by Tel Aviv University. But for some time they were being run by a group called the Elad organization. And Elad was a private institution that was hired by the Antiquities Authority. And it's a settler organization with very clear ties towards establishing a Jewish presence in the predominantly Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan, and really trying to show the Jewish roots of the city itself. And part of that is this large step-stoned structure, which on the basis of some associated artifacts has been dated to around this time of David. Now the archaeology is very, very problematic. There are no sealed contexts with objects in it to date this structure to the time of David. Again, you have people like Israel Finkelstein and others saying that, again, this is a much later structure, possibly, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. So a great example, again, of the tie between archaeology and the politics of the present. And this, again, if you travel to this region too, it's very, very tense, and there are all sorts of protests taking place every Friday, rock throwing, the whole 9 yards, everything that you've heard of in terms of protests in Israel. But in this case, archaeology playing a key role in that conflict. So, moving on. After the death of Solomon, regardless of whether his empire was large or small, the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital first at Shechem, and later at Samaria, and then into the southern kingdom of Judah. And this period, again, is documented not just by the Bible, but also by Assyrian sources as well. And this is the period, right, in which we saw a tremendous amount of Assyrian interaction. By the mid-9th century, Assyria is in contact and interacting with Israel and Judah. Samaria becomes the capital of Israel. We'll start with the north, Israel, under Omri in the early 9th century, around 874 BCE. And the city sits on a large hill with a royal acropolis, and uses fine ashlar masonry and these proto-Aeolic capitals, which come to define architecture not just in the north, but as we'll see also in the south. Here's an example of some of these proto-Aeolic and proto-Ionic columns, again, dating to the 9th and 8th centuries. And we see these at sites all over the north and the south, sites like Tel Dan, Hatzor, Megiddo, in addition to massive fortifications. The building of what are called casemate walls, double walls with interior sections. And you can actually find biblical references to people who lived in the wall. For a long time, people didn't understand what this means. What do you mean, live in a wall? How do you live in a wall? That's very strange. Well, actually, when you look at a casemate wall, it becomes pretty clear, right? You can actually use these sections not only for fortifications, but also for storage and apparently also as living quarters. We're told that Omri's son, Ahab, marries a woman named Jezebel, again, another famous biblical character, the daughter of a Phoenician king of Tyre and Sidon. And again, the story goes that there are violent reactions against Jezebel and Ahab because they turn to idolatry and end up fighting a long war against Damascus. But what we do also see archaeologically, particularly at this